When cities were bombed into rubble, they were rebuilt with new ideas, wider streets, open spaces, careful planning. When families were separated by war, they learned a kind of strength that passed quietly from parent to child, and from child to grandchild. When soldiers needed medicine, radar, and stronger materials, inventors worked through the night, and what they created found its way into our kitchens, our hospitals, our pockets. These 101 facts explore how World War II still lives in the ordinary moments of today. Some connections are easy to spot, others are subtle, almost invisible, but together they tell a quiet story, that the past never truly disappears. It simply becomes the ground beneath our feet, shaping every step we take. Fact number 1. Every time you look at a map and find the country of Israel, you're looking at one of the most direct traces the Second World War left on the modern world. Before the war, about 9.5 million Jewish people lived across Europe. By 1945, roughly 6 million of them had been killed in the Holocaust. Nearly 2/3 of Europe's entire Jewish population gone in under 6 years. That immense loss changed the conversation about a safe Jewish homeland in a way nothing else could have. The United Nations looked carefully at the situation in 1947, and the evidence of what it meant to have no country, no safety, no refuge, was impossible to set aside. In May of 1948, the State of Israel was declared. The displacement that followed, the wars of 1948, 1967, and 1973, and the ongoing tensions in the region today, all of it has its roots in the same soil as the Holocaust. The war created conditions that made a new state possible, and everything surrounding that state still shapes the news today. Fact number 2. In the summer of 1944, while the war was still very much ongoing, a quiet but enormously important gathering took place at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Economists, bankers, and government officials came together with one purpose: to rebuild the financial foundations of the world before the fighting had even finished. From that meeting came the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both of which still exist today, still shaping which countries receive loans, which currencies are trusted, and how the world responds when economies begin to fail. That same agreement established the US dollar as the world's primary reserve currency, a position it has never fully let go of. Every time oil is priced in dollars, every time a developing nation repays a loan, every time the World Bank funds a school or a bridge somewhere far from Washington, the fingerprints of that 1944 hotel meeting are still quietly there. The systems have shifted many times since. The gold standard was eventually abandoned, the euro arrived, new currencies have grown. But the basic skeleton of the global economy was assembled in the middle of a war by people determined that financial chaos would never again help bring the world to ruin. Fact number 3. Before the war, penicillin was little more than a fascinating observation. A scientist named Alexander Fleming had noticed back in 1928 that a certain mold could kill bacteria, but turning that observation into actual medicine was an entirely different challenge. It took the desperate urgency of war, thousands of soldiers dying from infected wounds, to push the British and American governments to fund production on a scale that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. By the time Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, there was enough penicillin available to treat every serious infection among the troops. That effort unlocked the age of antibiotics. Within a decade, penicillin and the medicines it inspired were saving millions of ordinary civilian lives, people who would previously have died from pneumonia, from infected cuts, from illnesses that had once been near certain death sentences. The average human lifespan in 1945 was around 48 years. Today it's over 73. Antibiotics are one of the most significant reasons for that change. Every time a doctor hands someone a simple prescription for an infection, a quiet piece of that wartime emergency is still quietly at work. Fact number 4. The jet engine wasn't born during the Second World War. A British engineer named Frank Whittle had already sketched the idea back in 1930. But it's because of the war that you can board a plane today and be on the other side of the world in hours. Without the enormous investment that both Britain and Germany poured into jet propulsion during the war years, the technology would have crept forward slowly, shaped only by the modest demands of peacetime aviation markets. By 1944, jet-powered aircraft were flying on both sides of the conflict. After the war, the engineers, the blueprints, and the discoveries from both sides were absorbed into the growing commercial aviation world. By the 1950s, passengers were crossing oceans in jet aircraft. By the 1970s, wide-bodied planes were making international travel genuinely affordable for the first time in history. The global tourism industry, the supply chains that move goods between continents in days, the connected business culture linking cities from Tokyo to Toronto, all of it runs on jet propulsion. The war didn't invent flight, but it compressed decades of engine development into just a few years, and the whole world has been moving faster ever since. Fact number 5. The microwave oven sitting on most kitchen counters today was born from an accident in 1945, and that accident only happened because the war had built radar. An American engineer named Percy Spencer was working on radar equipment when he noticed that a chocolate bar in his pocket had melted while he stood near an active radar device. Curious, he began experimenting. He pointed the device at popcorn kernels, watched them pop, then tried an egg, which promptly exploded. He had discovered something entirely new. The first commercial microwave appeared in 1947. It was nearly 6 feet tall and weighed as much as a large motorcycle. By the late 1970s, compact versions were sitting in millions of homes around the world. This is how wartime technology tends to find its way into daily life. Not through grand planned transfers, but through the sheer density of invention that war forces into motion. Radar itself remained central to aviation, weather forecasting, and shipping, but one of its most intimate and domestic legacies is the quiet hum of a box reheating yesterday's dinner. Spencer never personally profited from his discovery. Records suggest he received a $2 bonus from his employer. Fact number 6. In 1940, roughly 76 million people lived in the United States. Then the soldiers came home. Between 1946 and 1964, American families welcomed approximately 76 million babies into the world. The baby boom, a wave of new life so large that its effects are still visibly reshaping society today. Young men had returned from war, had delayed marriage and family, and now found themselves in a country building highways, suburbs, and a consumer economy at extraordinary speed. Birth rates climbed sharply and stayed high for nearly 2 decades. Those babies became the largest generation in American history. They filled schools in the 1950s, questioned everything in the 1960s, drove the workforce from the 1970s onward, and are now retiring in such numbers that pension systems and healthcare budgets across the Western world are feeling the strain. The debates today about social security, about the cost of elder care, about the political voice of older generations, all of it connects back to the enormous energy released when a generation of young people finally came home from war and started building families. Fact number 7. In April 1945, American soldiers arrived at the Buchenwald concentration camp and found survivors barely able to stand. That autumn, in the German city of Nuremberg, prosecutors gathered to put senior Nazi officials on trial for acts so extreme that the law had no name for them yet. The phrase crimes against humanity was essentially invented at Nuremberg to describe what had been done. Before 1945, international law was mostly concerned with how countries treated each other. Nuremberg said something new and radical, that how a government treats its own people could also be a crime, one that the wider world had a right to address. The principles that emerged from those trials became the foundation for the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and eventually the International Criminal Court. Every international war crimes trial, every time a leader is held accountable for what they did to their own citizens, traces its legal roots back to that courtroom. The trial was imperfect, and many questioned whether it was truly justice. But the framework it created changed the relationship between power and accountability in ways that are still felt today. Fact number 8. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a single bomb fell on the city of Hiroshima and changed the world forever. The explosion killed tens of thousands of people in moments, and by the end of that year, the death toll had climbed to between 90,000 and 140,000 as burns, radiation, and collapse of the city's basic services claimed those who had survived the initial blast. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The nuclear age had arrived. Every aspect of international relations since that morning has been shaped in some way by the existence of these weapons. The long decades of Cold War tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, the arms control agreements, the concept of deterrence, the idea that the threat of mutual destruction could prevent war, and even what some call the long peace, the fact that major powers haven't directly fought each other since 1945, all orbit around the bomb. Today, roughly 12,500 nuclear warheads exist across 9 countries. The war created the weapon, and the weapon has been quietly governing international behavior ever since. Fact number 9. Before the war, radar was a closely guarded secret that several countries were developing in parallel without knowing about each other. By 1945, it had been so thoroughly refined that it had changed naval combat, aerial warfare, and strategic bombing forever. After the war ended, nobody locked the technology away. Radar became the backbone of civilian air traffic control, the reason that tens of thousands of commercial flights can share the skies each day without colliding. Every major airport in the world uses technology that descends directly from a system Britain built in 1937 to watch for incoming German bombers. Weather forecasting relies on radar too. The Doppler systems that track storms and issue warnings work on the same basic principle. Maritime navigation, Coast Guard operations, speed monitoring on roads, and certain medical imaging techniques all draw on the same wartime foundation. Radar was built not out of academic curiosity, but from the absolute and urgent need to know where enemy aircraft were. That urgent need produced a technology so genuinely useful that it wove itself permanently into the infrastructure of daily life, before most people had even paused to wonder where it came from. Fact number 10. The world's first programmable electronic computer, known as Colossus, was built in Britain in 1943 for a single purpose: breaking the coded messages of the Nazi military. It processed information faster than any human team could hope to match, and the intelligence it helped unlock contributed directly to Allied decisions that shaped the outcome of the war. Around the same time, a similar machine called ENIAC was being developed in the United States, built to calculate artillery trajectories. These machines were enormous, temperamental, and consumed staggering amounts of electricity, but they proved something essential. Electronic computation was real, it worked, and it was fast enough to change the course of events. After the war, the engineers and mathematicians who had built and theorized these systems kept going. The transistor came, then the integrated circuit, then the personal computer, then the internet, then the device in your pocket. Every step was built on the one before it, and the chain begins with machines constructed because a war needed to break codes. The computer is not metaphorically connected to the war, it was literally built for it. Fact number 11. On June the 22nd, 1944, the United States Congress passed a law that changed American society more deeply than almost anything else in that century. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, most people called it the GI Bill, offered returning veterans free college education, low-interest home loans, unemployment support, and job training. Nearly 8 million veterans took advantage of the education benefits alone. Millions more bought homes. The law effectively created the American middle class as we recognize it, filling universities that had once been reserved for the wealthy with the sons of factory workers and farmers, and funding the construction of new suburban neighborhoods from coast to coast. But the GI Bill also had a painful shadow. African American veterans were largely denied equal access to its benefits, despite having served in the same war. That exclusion deepened racial inequality in housing and education in ways still visible today, and it added fuel to the civil rights movement that followed. The GI Bill built the world's largest college-educated workforce, a vast and hopeful middle class, and a set of racial inequities that still shape American life. All of it flows from one government's decision to invest in the people who had fought its war. Fact number 12. When France fell to Germany in June 1940, Britain found itself standing alone. The government launched one of the most ambitious efforts in history to hold civilian morale together under conditions of extreme and unrelenting pressure. The BBC, the rationing system, the evacuation of children, and the carefully managed flow of public information were all tools for keeping a nation calm and functional beneath the weight of war. The experience taught governments something they have never forgotten: that how you communicate with your people during a crisis is as important as what you actually do. The BBC itself emerged from the war with a worldwide reputation for reliability that it still draws upon today. The idea that governments should actively and honestly inform their populations during emergencies, the whole model of public health communication we saw clearly during the COVID-19 pandemic, was built on frameworks developed in those difficult wartime years. The same machinery created to rally people against fascism can of course be pointed in other directions, but the infrastructure of large-scale public communication as a tool of responsible governance was built in wartime, and it remains in place today. Fact number 13. Before the war, Germany had been quietly developing synthetic rubber because it had been cut off from the natural rubber growing in Southeast Asia. The technology worked but was expensive. Then Japan seized Malaya and the Dutch East Indies in 1941 and 1942. Cutting off Allied access to roughly 90% of the world's natural rubber supply almost overnight. The United States responded with an emergency program to produce synthetic rubber at a scale no one had previously attempted. By 1944, America was producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber per year, compared to fewer than 10,000 tons before the war. After the war, production continued, because the material had proven itself cheaper and more versatile than the natural alternative. Car tires, shoe soles, medical gloves, wetsuits, hoses. The modern world runs on synthetic rubber. Almost every tire on every vehicle today is synthetic or blended. The entire global transport network depends on a material that was mass-produced at scale because a series of island conquests cut off the original supply, and necessity, as it so often does, found another way. Fact number 14. In 1945, roughly a third of the world's population lived under European colonial rule. By 1975, nearly all of those colonies were independent nations. The war is the single largest reason that transformation happened when it did. It destroyed the image of European invincibility, particularly in Asia. Japan had demonstrated that a non-European power could decisively defeat European armies. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 shattered the myth of British dominance in Asia in a single afternoon. India's independence movement was energized directly by the war. France was expelled from Vietnam after its wartime humiliation. Indonesia declared independence from the Netherlands in 1945. Ghana became independent in 1957, and a wave of African nations followed through the 1960s. The world map today, with its 195 countries, its borders, its regional tensions and alliances, is largely a product of that decolonization, which was itself a product of the war. The borders drawn hastily by departing colonial powers, the ethnic and political complexities left unaddressed, the economic legacies of extraction, all of this continues to shape the lives of billions of people today. Fact number 15. The United Nations was founded in October 1945 by 51 nations. Its founding document had been drafted partly while the war was still being fought, by people who had watched the League of Nations fail to prevent catastrophe, and were determined to try again, more carefully. Today the UN has 193 member states. It is imperfect, frequently slowed by the veto powers of its permanent Security Council members, regularly criticized for not doing enough. But it is also home to the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the World Food Programme, the UN Refugee Agency, and dozens of other bodies that collectively form the scaffolding of international cooperation. The WHO coordinates global health responses. UNICEF protects children in conflict zones. The World Food Programme reaches people in famines that would otherwise receive no organized help at all. None of this machinery existed before the war. The choice to try building an international order, rather than simply returning to competing national interests, was a direct lesson drawn from the catastrophe of 1939 to 1945. The machinery is flawed, but the alternative, The world before 1945, where no such framework existed at all, was considerably worse. Fact number 16. In 1949, 12 nations came together and signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating NATO. The alliance was built to prevent Soviet expansion into a Western Europe still reeling from the war, and it has spent 8 decades doing exactly that, without ever fighting a direct war with the Soviet Union or its successor. Today, NATO has 32 member states, including, as of 2024, Finland and Sweden, countries that had maintained careful neutrality for most of the Cold War. After 1991, many questioned whether the alliance was still needed. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 answered that question with devastating clarity. NATO exists because the war ended with a powerful and ideologically hostile Soviet Union sitting on the border of an exhausted Western Europe, and the United States decided it could not simply sail home as it had done after the First World War. The concept of collective defense, the American military presence in Europe, the entire architecture of Western security, all of it was assembled between 1947 and 1955 in direct response to how the war had ended. Every news story about NATO today connects back to that same quiet starting point. Fact number 17. In June 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed something that had never been done before on such a scale: a deliberate, systematic effort by one nation to rebuild the shattered economies of others. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States gave 16 European nations the equivalent of roughly $175 billion in today's money. The Marshall Plan rebuilt factories, roads, ports, railways, and financial systems. It created the economic conditions for Western Europe's remarkable recovery and helped make democracy viable in countries that had been teetering toward communism out of sheer desperation and hunger. The plan also established something that endured long after the rebuilding was done: the model of large-scale foreign economic aid as both a moral commitment and a strategic tool. The World Bank, USAID, and the development aid policies of Western governments today are conceptual descendants of Marshall's original proposal. Germany, the country that had started the war, received the largest single share of Marshall aid, a deliberate choice reflecting the belief that rebuilding former enemies is wiser than punishing them. It was a lesson drawn directly from the failures of the Versailles settlement after the First World War. Fact number 18. When the war ended, roughly 40 million Europeans were displaced, outside their home countries, living in camps, wandering roads, with no documents and no clear destination. The world had to build, essentially from nothing, a legal framework for what to do with people who had lost their countries. The 1951 Refugee Convention, which still defines who counts as a refugee and what rights they're entitled to, was written directly in response to that crisis. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was established in 1950 specifically to manage the ongoing displacement the war had left behind. The UNHCR today oversees the world's largest refugee situations, including over 100 million people currently displaced by conflict, persecution, and climate disaster. The legal definition of a refugee, someone who cannot safely return home because of a well-founded fear of persecution, was written by people looking directly at Holocaust survivors and the ruins of Eastern Europe. Every asylum claim, every resettlement program, every debate about borders and migration draws on a legal framework crafted in the late 1940s to deal with the specific human consequences of this specific war. Fact number 19. Duct tape was invented in 1943 by Johnson & Johnson, working under contract for the US military. The task was simple and urgent: create a waterproof tape that could seal ammunition cases and keep moisture out of equipment in the field. The tape used a cotton fabric backing, a waterproof coating, and a strong rubber adhesive. Soldiers discovered almost immediately that it had dozens of uses its inventors never imagined: sealing boots, patching tents, holding broken equipment together in conditions where nothing else would work. After the war, it moved into civilian life almost without pause. It was used to seal heating and air conditioning ductwork in new homes, which is actually where the name duct tape comes from. From there it spread into garages, workshops, film sets, and the toolboxes of anyone who fixes things for a living. NASA has used it aboard the International Space Station. Apollo 17 astronauts used it to repair a fender on their lunar rover. A material invented to keep ammunition dry in 1943 became one of the most universally trusted tools in human history. The war had no idea it was giving the world something so endlessly useful. But it did. Fact number 20. Before the war, blood transfusion was difficult and genuinely dangerous. Blood couldn't be stored safely for more than a few days. Transfusions required a direct donor-to-patient connection, and blood typing wasn't reliably used in emergencies. The desperate need to save soldiers who would otherwise bleed to death drove enormous advances in blood banking. Safe storage techniques, mobile blood banks that could operate in field conditions, and large-scale organized donation programs. By the end of the war, transfusion had been transformed from a specialist procedure into a standard part of trauma care. The American Red Cross had processed over 13 million pints of donated blood for military use by 1945. After the war, all of that infrastructure and knowledge moved seamlessly into civilian medicine. The blood bank at your local hospital, the donation drives at schools and workplaces, the ability of surgeons to operate on patients who would previously have been unsavable, all of it was built on the wartime blood supply system. The war forced medicine to solve blood storage at a massive scale, and that solution has since saved hundreds of millions of civilian lives across the world. Fact number 21. In the 1930s, the American economy had been brought to its knees by the Great Depression. A quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Industrial production had collapsed. It was the war, specifically the enormous government spending required to build tanks, ships, aircraft, and ammunition, that finally ended the Depression. Between 1939 and 1945, U.S. economic output grew by nearly 40%, and unemployment essentially disappeared as millions entered military service and millions more entered the workforce. The lesson embedded in that recovery was profound, that deliberate government spending could rescue an economy that markets alone were failing to fix. After the war, the United States and most Western European governments accepted that they had a responsibility to manage their economies actively, not simply wait for things to correct themselves. The post-war welfare state, universal healthcare in Britain, social insurance systems across Europe, meaningful unemployment support, was built on the political understanding that governments could and should use public spending to maintain stability and social well-being. Every modern argument about economic stimulus, about government deficits, about the state's role in times of crisis, all of it takes place in a space the war's recovery helped open. Fact number 22. African American soldiers fought in every theater of the war: the Pacific, Europe, North Africa, often with extraordinary courage and skill. They came home to a country that still denied them the vote in much of the South, still barred them from public spaces, still paid them less and housed them in worse conditions than their white counterparts. The gap between what they had been told they were fighting for and what they returned to was simply too wide to ignore. The WWII campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home, had been articulated even while the war was still going on. In the years that followed, civil rights organizations pressed harder and with new moral authority. Thurgood Marshall won Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court in 1954. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in 1955. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s drew enormous moral force from the contradiction between wartime sacrifice and post-war injustice. President Truman desegregated the military in 1948, partly from conviction, partly because racial discrimination was becoming an embarrassment in a country claiming to lead the free world. The war didn't create racial justice, but it helped make racial injustice harder to sustain at the levels that had existed before. Fact number 23. Before the war, women in Western countries were largely excluded from heavy industry and most professional roles. Then the men left for the front, and factories still needed to run. In Britain and the United States, women moved into munitions plants, shipyards, aircraft assembly lines, and administrative positions that had been entirely male before. By 1944, women made up 36% of the American civilian workforce. Britain produced nearly half its wartime industrial output through female labor. When the war ended, many women were pushed back out of those roles to make room for returning veterans. But something had shifted that couldn't be fully reversed. Women had demonstrated to themselves and to the world that they could do these jobs, not occasionally, not reluctantly, but consistently and well. The wages, the independence, and the experience created a generation with different expectations. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s drew directly on the generation that had worked those assembly lines. Their daughters and granddaughters asked, quite reasonably, why the jobs had been taken back. The post-war push for equal pay, equal professional access, and greater social equality built on a foundation the war had laid, one that proved, at enormous scale, that gender restrictions on work were matters of habit and custom, not of capacity. Fact number 24. Before 1939, international air travel was an expensive rarity enjoyed by a very small and privileged group. By 1945, the world had thousands of military-trained pilots, enormous quantities of surplus aircraft, and an extensive network of airstrips and routes built entirely for the war effort. The aviation industry absorbed nearly all of it without hesitation. Aircraft that had carried troops across oceans began carrying passengers. The routes flown by bombers became the skeleton of civilian air corridors. The transatlantic route that had carried American soldiers to Britain was carrying tourists and business travelers within a few years. Even the rules governing international aviation were written during the war. The Chicago Convention of 1944 set the global standards that still govern commercial flight today. Every international airport still uses the code system established then. Every commercial flight still follows procedures drafted by people who were building the post-war world while the war was still being fought. The war connected the world in a way that took what had been an elite novelty and turned it, within a generation, into something available to almost anyone. Fact number 25. Superglue, properly called cyanoacrylate, was discovered in 1942 almost entirely by accident. Dr. Harry Cover was working for Eastman Kodak, trying to develop clear plastic gun sights for the military, when a compound he was testing stuck his instruments together so firmly he couldn't separate them. Frustrated, he set it aside. 6 years later, another researcher at the same company rediscovered the same substance and recognized what it actually was. Superglue reached stores in 1958. Today it's used in woodworking, electronics, shoe repair, and surgery. Doctors use versions of cyanoacrylate to close certain wounds without sutures. Military medicine uses it to seal battlefield wounds quickly when time is critical. The story of superglue is the story of hundreds of wartime discoveries. Something found accidentally while solving an urgent problem, set aside, rediscovered, and eventually transformed into something sitting quietly in almost every household toolbox in the world. The war was running so many research programs simultaneously that accidents were practically inevitable. Many of those accidents became the everyday objects that outlasted everything else about the war by half a century or more. Fact number 26. In 1940, the British government made a decision that would reshape society for decades to come. To feed a nation cut off from its usual food imports by German submarines, it introduced a rationing system that allocated food not by wealth but by need. For the first time, a wealthy family and a factory worker's family received the same butter ration. The result was quietly remarkable. Infant mortality fell during the war, the national diet became more balanced, and for many poorer families, the ration actually provided more reliable nutrition than they had known before. The experience confirmed what public health advocates had argued for years, that state involvement in food and health could produce better outcomes than markets alone. The National Health Service, launched in Britain in 1948, followed the same underlying logic, that healthcare, like wartime food, should be distributed by need rather than by the ability to pay. The NHS still operates today, serving 67 million people, funded by taxation, free at the moment of care. It is one of the most direct institutional legacies of the quiet social compact that the British people and their government forged under the pressure of war. Fact number 27. Before the Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1946 and 1947, No international standard existed governing what medical researchers were permitted to do to human subjects. Nazi doctors had conducted horrific experiments on concentration camp prisoners, surgeries without anesthesia, exposure to freezing temperatures, deliberate infection, and there had been no explicit law against it, because no one had thought such a law was needed. After the trial, in 1947, the Nuremberg Code was written. Its 10 principles established that voluntary, informed consent is absolutely essential before any medical experiment can take place. That code shaped the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, still the global standard for medical research ethics, and the Belmont Report of 1979, which governs all human subjects research in the United States. Every clinical trial, every vaccine safety study, every pharmaceutical test anywhere in the world today operates under ethical rules that were written in direct response to what those doctors did in the camps. The modern system of ethics committees, review boards, and informed consent procedures was built from the wreckage of the worst medical crimes in history. It is imperfect, but it exists because of what happened, and its existence matters every single time a new medicine is tested on a human being. Fact number 28. In August 1945, Japan surrendered, and the United States began a 7-year occupation of a country it had just fought in the most violent conflict in history. General Douglas MacArthur oversaw the writing of a new Japanese constitution, which came into effect in 1947. At its heart was Article 9, a clause renouncing war as a sovereign right and prohibiting Japan from maintaining offensive military forces. Japan has kept this clause for nearly 80 years, though its interpretation has gradually shifted to allow for self-defense. The decision to spend almost nothing on a military freed Japan to pour its resources into building an industrial economy, contributing to what became known as the Japanese economic miracle. Today, Japan is the world's third largest economy. It is also one of the very few major nations in history to have constitutionally opted out of war as a policy tool, a choice made in 1947 under occupation, as a direct consequence of how the war ended. Whether that constitution can hold in an increasingly unsettled Asia is one of the most important open questions in modern geopolitics. Fact number 29. The Holocaust gave the world a new word and a new crime. In 1944, a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin published a book in which he coined the term genocide, combining the Greek word for people or tribe with the Latin word for killing, to describe what the Nazis were doing. Through relentless effort while the war was still ongoing, he pressed the international community to recognize it. The result was the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted in December 1948, the first time in history that the deliberate destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group was named and prohibited under international law. The convention has since been invoked in proceedings related to Rwanda, to Srebrenica, to Myanmar, and to other cases around the world. It is enforced imperfectly, depending on political will that the international community often struggles to find, but its existence has changed what can be said, demanded, and legally argued when mass atrocities occur. One word, coined by one man who lost 49 members of his own family in the Holocaust, became one of the weightiest words in international law. Fact number 30. For most of human history, disease killed more soldiers than combat ever did. In the American Civil War, roughly 2 men died of illness for every 1 killed in battle. In the First World War, the Spanish flu claimed more lives than the fighting itself. The Second World War changed this ratio for the first time. For American forces, deaths from disease fell to a small fraction of combat deaths. A shift driven by sulfur drugs, penicillin, improved surgery, better organized military medicine, and a massive campaign using DDT to control malaria-carrying mosquitoes in the Pacific and African theaters. After the war, these advances moved into global public health. The WHO's malaria eradication program of the 1950s and 1960s used DDT across entire continents, saving millions of civilian lives across Asia and Africa before environmental concerns led to its restriction in the 1970s. The war not only advanced individual medicines, it changed the fundamental relationship between military and civilian medicine, creating tools powerful enough to shift the demographics of entire regions and to extend human life in ways that had previously seemed impossible. Fact number 31. The space race was, in its deepest origins, a direct extension of the war. The V-2 rocket developed under the Nazi regime was the first human-made object to reach the edge of space during test flights in 1944. After Germany's defeat, both the United States and the Soviet Union gathered as many of the German rocket scientists and as much V-2 hardware as they could find. Operation Paperclip brought Wernher von Braun and more than 1,600 other German scientists to the United States. Their work produced the rockets that put America's first satellite in orbit in 1958 and eventually carried human beings to the moon in 1969. The Soviet program used captured V-2 technology to launch Sputnik in 1957. Every satellite in orbit today, the GPS network, the weather satellites, the communications satellites carrying television, internet, and phone signals across the globe, descends from a weapon designed to carry explosives across the English Channel. The war did not plan to give humanity the stars, but it built the first machine that reached them, and from that machine, everything else followed. Fact number 32. The years between 1939 and 1945 did more to accelerate electronics than any comparable period before or since. Radar needed miniaturized, reliable components. Code breaking required switching circuits of extraordinary complexity. Global communications required advances in radio technology that peacetime investment would never have funded. The vacuum tube had existed before the war, but wartime pressure reduced its size, increased its reliability, and produced it in industrial quantities. The transistor came in 1947. The integrated circuit in 1958. The microprocessor in 1971. The personal computer in the late 1970s, the internet through the 1980s and 1990s, the smartphone in 2007. Each step was built on the one before it, and that chain begins with the wartime need for reliable, fast, small-scale electronics. Computing power has roughly doubled every 2 years for decades, a pattern known as Moore's Law. That doubling began because a war needed to process information faster than any human mind could manage, and engineers and mathematicians rose to meet that need. The modern digital world is not distantly related to the war. It grew directly from it. Fact number 33. The war created between 55 and 70 million dead. It also created a generation of survivors who carried its weight for the rest of their lives, and research has since shown that some of that weight was passed quietly to their children and grandchildren. Children of Holocaust survivors show measurable differences in stress hormone regulation and rates of anxiety and depression compared to Jewish families who were not in Europe during the war. Similar patterns have appeared in descendants of Dutch civilians who survived the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, and among the children of atomic bomb survivors in Japan. These effects don't seem to be explained entirely by the stories told at dinner tables or the environments in which children were raised. Some appear to work through epigenetic mechanisms, meaning the war may have left chemical marks on DNA that were inherited by children who hadn't yet been born. The science of inherited trauma is still developing and still debated, but the evidence has grown large enough to take seriously. The war may have rearranged the biological inheritance of millions of families, expressed across 3 and 4 generations as altered stress responses, anxiety, and changed patterns of health and illness. Fact number 34. The Geneva Conventions, first established in the 19th century to protect wounded soldiers, were fundamentally expanded in 1949 in direct response to what the Second World War had shown was possible. The 4 updated conventions cover wounded soldiers on land and at sea, prisoners of war, and, crucially for the first time, the protection of civilian populations living under military occupation. The 4th Geneva Convention was written in explicit response to what had happened under German occupation across Europe, and to the treatment of Jewish and other civilian populations during those years. The conventions are violated regularly. The history of every conflict since 1949 includes breaches, but they also create a framework for accountability that simply did not exist before. War crimes prosecutions, International Court of Justice rulings, United Nations investigations into civilian casualties. All of these operate on a legal foundation assembled between 1945 and 1949, specifically because the world had just witnessed what happens when there are no rules at all, and nobody had prepared to enforce them. Fact number 35. For most of history, the amount of money a government could create was tied to how much physical gold it held, a system called the gold standard. The Depression had already strained this approach. The war broke it. Governments needed to spend money they simply did not have, and they needed to spend it immediately. The system designed at Bretton Woods in 1944 tried to maintain stability by pegging all currencies to the US dollar and the dollar to gold, but with more flexibility than before. In 1971, President Nixon ended dollar-to-gold convertibility entirely, completing the shift to the fiat money system that now governs every currency in the world. In a fiat system, the value of money rests entirely on trust and careful management, not on vaults of gold. This makes modern tools like inflation adjustment, money printing, and quantitative easing possible. Whether this system is safer or more dangerous than the gold standard remains a genuine debate among economists, but the shift toward it was driven by the war's demands for spending that no gold reserve in the world could have supported. The paper in your wallet traces its philosophical origins to a wartime emergency that changed money itself. Fact number 36. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States government interned approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, the majority of them American citizens, in camps across the western states, without charge and without trial. German and Italian Americans were not interned at comparable scale. The policy was authorized by Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt in February 1942, and upheld by the Supreme Court 2 years later in a ruling that was not formally overturned until 2018. In 1988, Congress apologized and paid reparations to surviving detainees. The internment has since become a central reference point in American civil liberties debates, cited in discussions about the treatment of Muslim Americans after September 11, 2001, in arguments about immigration detention, and in questions about executive power during national emergencies. The question of how a democracy treats minorities when it is frightened, and how courts respond when governments claim security justifies rights violations, is a question every generation faces. The Japanese-American internment remains the 20th century's most prominent American example of getting that question profoundly wrong, and its shadow still shapes legal and political debates today. Fact number 37. The war produced the world's first effective ballistic missile. The V-2 rocket killed approximately 9,000 people, mostly civilians in London and Antwerp, during the final months of the war. But its real legacy wasn't what it destroyed in those months, it was what it made possible afterward. Every intercontinental ballistic missile ever built descends from V-2 technology. The Soviet missile that launched Sputnik was derived from it. The American rockets that carried the first astronauts drew from the same lineage. The entire architecture of Cold War nuclear strategy, mutual assured destruction, submarine-launched missiles, missile defense systems costing trillions of dollars, begins with a weapon designed by engineers working under a murderous regime in the early 1940s. The V-2 killed relatively few people compared to the broader destruction of the war, but it changed the nature of military threat more completely than almost any other invention. Every year since 1945, the possibility of what those early rockets made possible has quietly governed the calculations of every major power in the world. Fact number 38. The war transformed what clothes, containers, and everyday objects are made of. Nylon had been invented by DuPont in 1938, but when the United States entered the war, it was immediately redirected. Parachutes, ropes, aircraft tires all needed it. The civilian nylon stocking disappeared for the duration. After the war, nylon returned and became the foundation of the synthetic textiles industry. Polyester, acrylic, and polypropylene followed through the 1950s. Today, synthetic fibers make up more than 60% of all textile production globally. The plastic packaging covering nearly every food product in a modern supermarket. The synthetic insulation in winter coats, the performance fabrics in athletic wear. All of these trace back to wartime chemistry programs that needed to replace materials that had been cut off by blockades or were needed for military use. The war created the materials science industry by throwing enormous resources at the problem of substitution. The materials it produced were so useful and affordable that they remade the physical texture of daily life. The trade-off: much of this material doesn't decompose, and it now fills oceans and landfills, wasn't something anyone was thinking about in the 1940s. But that too is part of the war's legacy. Fact number 39. Japan's occupation of Korea and China left wounds that have never fully healed. Korea had been a Japanese colony since 1910. The occupation involved forced labor, the suppression of Korean culture, and the systematic recruitment of women, many of them Korean, into what were called comfort stations, a name that obscured a system of organized sexual slavery involving an estimated 50,000 to 200,000 women across occupied territories. Japan's post-war acknowledgement of these crimes has been partial and inconsistent. Official apologies have been offered, then walked back by nationalist politicians, then offered again. Survivor advocacy groups have pressed for fuller acknowledgement and reparations for decades. The comfort women issue remains one of the most significant obstacles in the relationship between Japan and South Korea, two countries that are supposed to be close strategic allies. Historical memory: who acknowledges what, how textbooks describe contested events, which apologies are considered genuine, is a live political issue in East Asia today. It directly affects military cooperation, trade relations, and the security of an entire region. The war's unfinished moral business is as present and consequential as any of its technological legacies. Fact number 40. Britain's welfare state wasn't born from a political theory. It was born from a war. In 1942, economist William Beveridge published a report identifying 5 giant evils facing British society: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness, and proposed a comprehensive system of social insurance to address all 5. The report sold over 600,000 copies. Ordinary people read it, talked about it, and believed in it. German propaganda mocked it as a promise the British government would never keep. In 1945, the Labour Party was elected on a platform built around delivering it. And between 1945 and 1951, they did exactly that. The National Health Service, national insurance, housing programs, and expanded public education followed. All of it was made politically possible because the war had already demonstrated, through rationing and evacuation and emergency medicine, that the state could organize social provision at a scale once thought impossible. The war had, in effect, run a 5-year experiment in collective care, and the experiment had worked. Britain's post-war welfare state became a model for the European social democracies that rebuilt themselves in the same years, and that model still defines the social contract across much of Europe today. Fact number 41. The term post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist until 1980. But the condition it describes was carried home by veterans of the Second World War just as surely as it was by those of every conflict before and since. Studies of WWII veterans conducted decades later found significantly elevated rates of anxiety, depression, nightmares, and emotional difficulty compared to men of the same age who had not served. Veterans' families often described fathers who could not speak about what they had seen, who flinched at sudden sounds, who were emotionally distant even when physically present, who found peace harder to navigate than war. The greatest generation ethos, quiet strength, stoic endurance, suppressed public acknowledgement of this for a long time. It was Vietnam that brought the condition into open view, but the research on Second World War veterans was what established the clinical picture, the pattern of symptoms, the timescales, the risk factors that led to the PTSD diagnosis in 1980. Every modern treatment for combat trauma was shaped partly by what those earlier veterans carried home, and what researchers eventually found when they looked carefully enough at what it had done to them. Fact number 42. Germany's division into East and West after 1945, and the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, became one of history's most vivid and painful social experiments. When the wall fell in 1989 and Germany reunified the following year, researchers could finally begin to measure what 4 decades of communist rule had done in health outcomes, in economic productivity, in levels of social trust, and in political attitudes compared to the democratic West. The productivity gap and the wage gap between Eastern and Western Germany were enormous. More remarkably, studies published years later showed that even people born after reunification in Eastern Germany held measurably different political attitudes and economic expectations, suggesting that 4 decades of a different system had effects that outlasted the system itself. The war's division of Germany was the condition that made this comparison possible. Its data has influenced policy debates about transition economies, about the lasting effects of political systems on human behavior, and about the relationship between freedom and prosperity. It was one of history's most costly experiments, and its findings are still being studied. Fact number 43. The United States had a long tradition after wars of bringing its soldiers home and reducing its military to peacetime levels. After the Second World War, for the first time in American history, it did not. The country maintained a large, globally deployed military force during peacetime, and it has done so ever since. The National Security Act of 1947 created the modern U.S. national security state. The Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, and the National Security Council. President Eisenhower, in his farewell address in 1961, coined the phrase military-industrial complex to describe the permanent partnership between government, industry, and the military that the war had built and that peacetime had never dismantled. U.S. military spending has never returned to pre-war levels. American forces operate in approximately 80 countries today. The aircraft carriers, the fighter jets, the global alliance network, all of it is the structure the war made permanent. Whether that presence has made the world safer or simply more entangled in conflicts that might otherwise have been avoided is one of the defining debates of American foreign policy. But the structure itself, a permanent global military establishment, was a direct creation of the Second World War. Fact number 44. The German occupation of France between 1940 and 1944 left a wound in French national identity that took decades to begin honestly confronting. The Vichy government's collaboration with the occupation, including the deportation of 77,000 French Jews to the death camps, was extensively documented but not officially acknowledged for a very long time. After the war, General de Gaulle constructed a national story in which France had been a nation of resistors, and the true scale of collaboration was quietly minimized in schools, in public memory, and in official speech. It was not until 1995 that a French president, Jacques Chirac, formally acknowledged the French state's responsibility for the deportations. The long, painful process of coming to terms with what Vichy had been, what historians called the Vichy syndrome, transformed French politics, feeding debates about identity, guilt, and institutional responsibility that echoed for generations. France's experience became a case study examined by many other post-conflict societies trying to understand how democracies come to terms with the darkest chapters of their own history. Fact number 45. The United States emerged from the Second World War in a position of dominance so overwhelming that the country had no real choice but to lead the world it had helped reshape. In 1945, America produced roughly half of the world's total industrial output. It held 2/3 of the world's gold. Its navy was larger than all other navies combined, and it was the only country that possessed nuclear weapons. The pre-war tradition of American isolationism, of staying out of other nations' affairs, was no longer plausible. Whether the country chose to or not, it had become the manager of the international order. That role has cost trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It has also provided the security guarantees that allowed Western Europe and much of East Asia to rebuild and flourish. The American-led international order that emerged from the war is the structure within which everything since 1945 has taken place. Whether it is changing, weakening, or ending, and what comes next, is one of the most consequential open questions in the world today. Fact number 46. Before the war, scientific research was largely funded by universities. private foundations, and individual companies. The war changed this permanently by demonstrating that government funding of science at massive scale could produce things that changed the course of history. The American office that coordinated wartime research directed the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars into radar, antibiotics, the atomic bomb, blood plasma, and dozens of other innovations. After the war, Vannevar Bush, who had run that office, argued that the government should continue funding basic scientific research indefinitely because the long-term returns were impossible to calculate in advance. The result was the National Science Foundation, established in 1950, and the dramatic expansion of the National Institutes of Health. Today, government funding accounts for the majority of basic scientific research globally. The medicines, technologies, and materials produced by that research form the backbone of the modern economy and the modern health system. The war proved the investment was worth making, proved it beyond any reasonable argument, and governments have been making it ever since. Fact number 47. When the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, one of their first actions was to dismiss Jewish scientists from universities and research institutions. Among those who fled was Albert Einstein, who eventually sent a letter to President Roosevelt that helped initiate the Manhattan Project. But Einstein was one among hundreds of physicists, chemists, mathematicians, and engineers who escaped Nazi-controlled Europe for Britain and the United States. Enrico Fermi, who produced the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction in Chicago in 1942, had left fascist Italy. John von Neumann, who made foundational contributions to computing and nuclear weapons design, had fled Hungary. The American scientific community of the post-war era was shaped to an extraordinary degree by refugees from fascism. Almost by accident, the United States received the greatest single transfer of scientific talent in history, because the regime it was fighting had been too ideologically rigid to recognize what it was throwing away. America's post-war scientific dominance, its universities, its technology industry, all of this was built partly on what fascism drove to its shores. Fact number 48. The war produced a revolution in trauma surgery that has saved millions of civilian lives since. The need to keep wounded soldiers alive long enough to reach surgical care drove the development of mobile operating units, battlefield blood transfusion, triage systems, and new techniques for treating burns, abdominal wounds, and shattered limbs. Plastic and reconstructive surgery advanced enormously, driven by the need to rebuild faces and bodies destroyed by burns and blast injuries. Harold Gillies and his cousin Archibald McIndoe in Britain performed pioneering reconstructive work on Royal Air Force pilots who had suffered severe burns, developing skin grafting and tissue reconstruction techniques that became the foundation of modern reconstructive surgery. Their patients, young men who had been badly burned, were treated not only physically but psychologically, with McIndoe insisting that mental recovery was as important as physical healing. Modern burn units, reconstructive surgery, and the psychological support of trauma victims all owe something to what those two surgeons learned from treating burned young men in a quiet Sussex hospital between 1940 and 1945. The war gave medicine problems it had to solve immediately, and the solutions it found were never set aside. Fact number 49. The words "never again" emerged from the Holocaust as a moral commitment, a declaration that genocide would not be permitted to happen again. The commitment has been imperfectly kept. The Cambodian genocide of 1975 to 1979 killed between 1.5 and 2 million people while the world largely looked away. The Rwandan genocide of 1994 killed approximately 800,000 people in 100 days while a UN force present in the country was ordered not to intervene. The Srebrenica massacre in 1995 occurred inside a declared UN safe area. These failures have not extinguished the commitment. If anything, they have hardened the argument for building better mechanisms to actually fulfill it. The responsibility to protect doctrine, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2005, tried to establish that sovereignty does not shield governments that commit mass atrocities against their own people. The history of never again since 1945 is a history of aspiration repeatedly failing to match reality. But the aspiration keeps returning, because the Holocaust created a moral standard that every subsequent atrocity is measured against, and that standard, however imperfectly applied, would not exist without the war. Fact number 50. In the immediate aftermath of the war, 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia in the largest forced population transfer in European history. The expulsions were brutal. Hundreds of thousands died from violence, cold, and disease during the transfers. Survivors arrived in a devastated Germany with almost nothing, absorbed into an economy and society already overwhelmed by its own destruction. Over the following 2 decades, most of those who had been expelled were successfully integrated into West German society, and they and their descendants became a significant part of the economic recovery that followed. The territorial arrangements legitimized by these population transfers, including Poland's western border and the Czech-German boundary, were not officially confirmed by West Germany until the 1970 Treaty of Warsaw, and were only finally settled under Germany's 1990 reunification agreements. The borders of Central Europe today are the direct product of population movements and diplomatic decisions made in the ashes of the war. Every border on today's map of the region was drawn, adjusted, or confirmed in the years immediately following 1945. Fact number 51. Japan's military expansion across Asia was accompanied by the systematic use of forced labor on a vast scale, not only of prisoners of war, but of civilian populations across the occupied territories. An estimated 670,000 Korean laborers were forced to work in Japanese war industries. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians were used as forced labor in Manchuria and occupied China. More than 300,000 Allied prisoners of war were put to work in dangerous conditions, including on the Burma Railway, the Death Railway, which killed approximately 100,000 workers, most of them Asian civilian laborers, from disease, malnutrition, and brutal treatment. The Allied victory freed these populations from formal military occupation. The Tokyo War Crimes trials held some Japanese commanders accountable, though the proceedings were criticized for inconsistency. The documentation of wartime forced labor has remained central to ongoing disputes between Japan and its neighbors over accountability and reparation. The legal framework for prosecuting forced labor as a war crime, established at Tokyo and Nuremberg, is now embedded in the Geneva Convention system still governing how prisoners and civilians must be treated in armed conflict today. Fact number 52. The war changed how children grow up, in ways still visible today. The mass evacuation of British children during the Blitz, the separation of families across occupied Europe, and the research that followed on what those separations did to children. All of this fed directly into the development of child psychology as a serious field. John Bowlby's work on attachment theory began with his study of evacuated children and those separated from parents by wartime disruption. He argued that the emotional bond between a child and their primary caregiver in early life was not merely desirable, it was essential for healthy development. That finding changed how hospitals treated children, how adoption was approached, how childcare was understood, and how early trauma was recognized as shaping adult mental health. Before Bowlby's research, hospitals routinely kept parents away from children in the ward, believing it was kinder. His evidence reversed that practice entirely. Today, a parent sitting beside a child in a hospital bed is standard and expected. The entire modern understanding of early childhood, secure attachment, and the long-term effects of childhood separation traces back to research that began with the children the war had moved. Fact number 53. The Nuremberg trials introduced film to legal proceedings in a way that has shaped justice and accountability ever since. The trials were extensively documented on film, the first major international legal proceedings to be recorded so comprehensively. The footage of concentration camps, shown to a stunned world in 1945, established that visual evidence of atrocity could and should be preserved and entered into the legal record. The documentary tradition of bearing witness to war crimes through film begins here. Today, video evidence of war crimes is central to international criminal prosecutions. Documentation from Syria, Myanmar, Ukraine, and Gaza, captured on smartphones and verified by satellite imagery, follows the same foundational principle. that atrocity must be recorded, preserved, and made visible rather than allowed to disappear into silence. The Nuremberg proceedings also introduced simultaneous translation, developed specifically for those trials, which became the standard for all United Nations proceedings afterward. The physical template of the International Criminal Tribunal, with its multinational prosecution teams and explicit defendants' rights, was established at Nuremberg and has been used in every international tribunal since. Fact number 54. After the war, West Germany made a decision that set it apart from nearly every other nation that had committed serious atrocities in the 20th century. It made confronting its own crimes a central part of national identity. The process was slow and contested. The first post-war decades saw considerable official silence, with many former Nazis quietly reintegrated into legal, political, and corporate life. But from the 1960s onward, a genuine culture of acknowledgement gradually took hold. Holocaust memorials, mandatory Holocaust education in schools, legal prohibitions on Holocaust denial, and billions of euros in reparations paid to Israel and to survivors. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, opened in 2005, covers an entire city block near the Brandenburg Gate. 2,711 concrete slabs of varying heights, a permanent and unavoidable presence in the heart of the capital. Germany's approach to its own history has been widely studied as a model, imperfect, still contested, but more thorough and sustained than almost any comparable effort anywhere in the world. The question of how nations honestly process historical crimes is one that every post-conflict society eventually faces. Germany's attempt remains the most extensive on record. Fact number 55. One of the most important people in the history of computing was Alan Turing, a British mathematician who spent the war breaking German codes at Bletchley Park. His theoretical framework for computation, developed before the war, became the conceptual foundation on which every computer ever built has rested. After the war, Turing continued working on computing theory and wrote a paper in 1950 introducing the idea now known as the Turing test, the concept that a machine might be considered intelligent if its responses were indistinguishable from a human's. In 1952, the British government prosecuted him for homosexuality. He was chemically castrated as a condition of avoiding prison. He died in 1954, aged 41, in circumstances that strongly suggested suicide. He received a royal pardon in 2013, 59 years after his death. The computing and artificial intelligence industry his work helped found is now worth over $5 trillion annually. The AI systems reshaping every aspect of modern work and life are direct intellectual descendants of the framework he built while helping win a war. The war gave him the problem. He gave the world the science. Society gave him a prosecution. Fact number 56. Every time you use GPS to navigate, you're using a system whose origin traces back through a long chain of Cold War developments that began with the war itself. When Sputnik launched in 1957, American scientists realized they could track its position by studying the Doppler shift of its radio signals, and, conversely, that they could determine a ground location if the satellite's position was precisely known. The first satellite navigation system was operational by 1960, used by the US Navy to locate its nuclear submarines that existed because of the nuclear balance the war had created. The modern GPS system was developed by the Department of Defense in the 1970s strictly for military use, and opened to civilian navigation in 1983. Today, GPS is used by an estimated 6.5 billion devices. It guides aircraft, ships, delivery fleets, emergency services, and the phone in your pocket. The chain of causation runs from the atomic bomb to the Cold War to Sputnik to submarine navigation to the app telling you where to turn left. The war didn't invent GPS, but it started every link in the chain that led to it. Fact number 57. The war left the ground of Europe and Asia contaminated with unexploded ordnance that is still being found and diffused today. It's estimated that roughly 10% of all bombs dropped during the war failed to detonate on impact. Across Germany, Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Britain, Japan, China, and the Pacific Islands, Construction workers, farmers, and coastal erosion continue to unearth bombs decades after the last shots were fired. Germany alone discovers approximately 2,000 tons of unexploded WWII ordnance every year. Major cities, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Berlin, conduct regular evacuations when bombs are found during construction projects, sometimes moving hundreds of thousands of people while disposal teams work carefully to make the device safe. In the Pacific nation of Palau, sections of beach and jungle remain inaccessible due to wartime munitions. In Laos, unexploded cluster munitions from the Vietnam-era bombing, itself a continuation of Cold War dynamics born from the Second World War, still kill and injure civilians every year. The war's physical presence in the earth is not a metaphor or a distant memory. It is an ongoing safety issue across multiple countries and multiple continents, 8 decades after it ended. Fact number 58. The war transformed nursing from a variable and often informal practice into a recognized profession with standardized training, clinical protocols, and distinct specializations. The enormous demand for medical care across every front meant that nurses were regularly performing procedures and making clinical decisions that had previously been reserved for physicians alone. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps grew from 7,000 nurses to over 57,000 by the war's end, serving in every theater under conditions of genuine physical hardship and sometimes under fire. The clinical experience accumulated during those years produced a generation of highly trained women who, after the war, pressed for the formalization of nursing education, degree programs, clear distinctions between trained nurses and ward assistants, and the recognition of nursing as an independent clinical discipline rather than a support role. The modern hospital, with its stratified nursing staff and clinical specializations, intensive care, surgical nursing, midwifery, was shaped in significant part by what wartime field medicine required nurses to know and to do. The professions these women built in peacetime were constructed directly from the skills and confidence the war had forced them to develop. Fact number 59. In 1945, the Soviet Union occupied the northern part of the Korean peninsula, while the United States occupied the south. The dividing line, the 38th parallel, was intended to be temporary, a holding arrangement until a political settlement could be reached. No settlement came. North Korea became a communist state. South Korea became a US-backed republic. In 1950, the North invaded the South. The war that followed killed approximately 3 million people and ended in 1953 with a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. The Korean War has technically never ended. The two Koreas are still separated by a demilitarized zone, still technically at war, still maintaining massive military forces facing each other across a border drawn as a temporary administrative convenience 8 decades ago. North Korea has since developed nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. Approximately 28,500 US troops remain stationed in South Korea today. The division of the Korean peninsula, and all that has unfolded from it, is a direct and still unresolved consequence of the way the Second World War ended, and of the Cold War confrontation that its ending produced. Fact number 60. The war produced the modern hospital system. Before 1939, hospitals in most countries were largely charitable or religious institutions, deeply uneven in quality, and largely inaccessible to ordinary people without means. The wartime emergency medical systems, Britain's Emergency Medical Service, the US Army Medical Department, demonstrated that large-scale, systematic medical care could be delivered to large populations efficiently and reliably. Britain's Emergency Medical Service effectively brought much of the hospital system under central coordination before the National Health Service formalized that arrangement in 1948. The U.S. Veterans Administration hospital network, massively expanded after the war to care for millions of returning veterans, became the largest integrated healthcare system in the country and a model for organized medicine. The idea that society owes systematic medical care to those who serve it, and perhaps to all its members, was made politically viable by what the wartime medical system had demonstrated was possible. The hospital ward you might visit today, with its departments and specializations, its triage systems and infection control, is organized according to principles first worked out under fire between 1939 and 1945. Fact number 61. The war gave the world freeze-dried coffee, which is a small thing, but it connects to a much larger story. Freeze-drying was developed during the war as a method of preserving blood plasma and penicillin for transport to the front without refrigeration. The technique removed water from a substance while it was frozen under vacuum, preserving its essential properties over distances and in conditions that would have destroyed ordinary storage. After the war, food scientists applied the same method to coffee and to food preservation broadly. Freeze-dried food became standard in military rations, then in emergency supplies, then in the space program, and eventually in the instant coffee in millions of office kitchens. More importantly, freeze-dried vaccines that can travel without cold chains to remote regions have been central to global vaccination programs. The efforts that have largely eliminated polio and significantly reduced measles and yellow fever in the developing world. These programs depend on preservation technologies that would not have been developed when they were without the wartime urgency to keep medicine alive over long distances. The instant coffee is a small footnote. The vaccines reaching children in remote clinics around the world are the real inheritance. Fact number 62. The war created the modern Paralympic movement. Ludwig Gutermann, a German Jewish neurologist who had fled to Britain in 1939, was appointed head of the National Spinal Injuries Centre at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in 1944. He was tasked with treating soldiers who had suffered spinal cord injuries, a group previously expected simply to die. Gutermann believed that sport was essential to rehabilitation, not as gentle therapy but as genuine competitive physical activity. In 1948, he organized the first Stoke Mandeville Games for wheelchair athletes, deliberately held on the same day as the opening of the London Olympics. In 1960, an international version was held in Rome following the Olympic Games, the first Paralympics. Today the Paralympic Games are the second largest sporting event in the world, involving over 4,400 athletes from more than 160 countries, held in the same city as the Olympic Games immediately after. The entire edifice of disability sport, the legal frameworks mandating accommodation for disabled people in public life, and the cultural shift in how disability is understood all trace back to a single doctor treating paralyzed soldiers in a Buckinghamshire hospital, quietly insisting that their lives still held possibility. Fact number 63. The war fundamentally changed the shape of cities in ways still visible today. The German city of Cologne lost 90% of its center to Allied bombing. Dresden, Hamburg and Warsaw, 85% of whose buildings were deliberately destroyed by the retreating German army, were rebuilt almost from scratch. Tokyo, Osaka, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were largely burned or bombed to rubble. The reconstruction of all these cities happened simultaneously in the late 1940s and 1950s, shaped by modernist planning ideals. The belief that scientific city planning could build something better than what had stood before. The result was the high-rise housing estate, the tower block, the large concrete residential developments that became the dominant form of mass housing across both Eastern and Western Europe, and in many American cities through the 1960s. Most of these estates have since been criticized, redesigned or demolished, because they failed in ways their designers hadn't anticipated. The European city today, with its combination of pre-war streets and post-war concrete, its gaps and its reconstructed centers, carries the physical imprint of the bombing in its very layout. You can read the war in the architecture of cities that were there for it. Fact number 64. The war created the modern environmental movement, though the connection isn't immediately obvious. The nuclear bomb tests that followed the war's end. The United States alone conducted over 1,000 between 1945 and 1992, spread radioactive fallout across the atmosphere in ways that crossed every border and coastline. The 1954 Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb test at Bikini Atoll was 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Its fallout contaminated a Japanese fishing vessel, sickened its crew, and spread measurable contamination across thousands of square miles of the Pacific. The public outrage that followed was the moment many people across many countries first began to think of the atmosphere as a shared environment that could be damaged in ways that belonged to everyone. The 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which ended atmospheric nuclear testing, was in a meaningful sense the world's first environmental treaty. The first international agreement limiting human activity specifically because of its effects on the shared natural world. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, drew explicit connections between chemical contamination and nuclear fallout. The environmental movement that produced the Paris Agreement was seeded in the fallout from a bomb test in 1954. Fact number 65. The war changed how the world thinks about debt. In 1945, the United States national debt stood at roughly 119% of GDP, higher than at almost any point before or since. Britain's was even higher. Every major combatant had borrowed enormously to fight. The answer, developed in the late 1940s and 1950s, involved not paying the debt off explicitly, but managing it away through a combination of strong economic growth, moderate inflation, and interest rates kept deliberately below inflation. The real value of the debt gradually eroded while the economy grew above it. It worked. US debt fell from 119% of GDP in 1946 to 31% by 1981. When the 2008 financial crisis left Western governments with debt levels comparable to post-war levels, economists and policymakers reached back explicitly to the post-war experience as a guide. The International Monetary Fund published papers drawing the comparison directly. The financial choices made in 1945 became the template for thinking about sovereign debt 70 years later. The debt management strategy of the post-war era is still being cited in central bank meetings today. Fact number 66. China had been at war, first with Japan, then with itself, for nearly 2 decades when Japan surrendered in August 1945. The defeat of Japan removed the common enemy that had temporarily paused the civil war between Mao Zedong's communist forces and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. By 1949, the communists had won. The People's Republic of China was established on October 1, 1949. The nationalists retreated to Taiwan. The world's most populous country was transformed. The decades that followed under communist rule brought campaigns that killed tens of millions. The Great Leap Forward caused a famine estimated to have killed between 15 and 55 million people. China's emergence as a global economic and military power in the 21st century, the unresolved status of Taiwan as a potential flashpoint for US-China conflict, China's permanent seat on the UN Security Council, all of it is traceable to the outcome of a civil war whose resumption was made possible by Japan's defeat in a war that had begun in 1937. The People's Republic of China, as it exists today, would not have come into being without the Second World War. Fact number 67. The war produced modern epidemiology. The need to control infectious disease among millions of soldiers and civilians crowded into ships, camps, and besieged cities drove the systematic development of methods for tracking how diseases spread, identifying their sources, and testing responses. After the war, the World Health Organization was established in 1948 specifically to apply these methods globally. The WHO's early malaria and tuberculosis programs brought epidemiological methods to scale across entire continents for the first time. The COVID-19 pandemic response, the tracking of case clusters, the study of transmission, the design and evaluation of vaccination programs across populations, used methods whose systematic development began in wartime military medicine. Epidemiology as a practical public health tool deployed at national and international scale, rather than an academic exercise, was built in the wartime emergency. The war taught public health how to think about scale, about populations rather than individuals, and about the relationship between data, intervention, and outcome. Every pandemic response since has drawn on that way of thinking. Fact number 68. The Marshall Islands and Bikini Atoll were the sites of 23 American nuclear tests between 1946 and 1958. The islanders were evacuated in 1946 with assurances they could return. Nearly 80 years later, they have never been able to return permanently. The soil still shows elevated radioactive contamination. The fish are unsafe to eat. The coconut crabs, once a food staple, concentrate radioactive material in their bodies. Some islanders were allowed back in 1969, but were moved again in 1978 when the contamination proved uncleared. The United States paid $183 million in 1986 as partial settlement of damage claims. The Bikinians' own Nuclear Claims Tribunal later determined $563 million was the appropriate figure, none of which has been paid. The people of Bikini Atoll have lived in displacement or contaminated homeland for 80 years because their island was used to test weapons whose development began with a war. Their story is not isolated. The people of the Marshall Islands, of the Kazakh steppe near Soviet test sites, and of Aboriginal Australian lands near British test sites at Maralinga, all carry the war's nuclear legacy in their bodies and in the land beneath their feet. Fact number 69. The war created the conditions for the economic transformation of East Asia. Japan's wartime industrialization and the American-backed Reconstruction that followed under MacArthur's occupation established the foundations for Japan's extraordinary post-war economic growth. Old industrial conglomerates were restructured. Land reform created a broad farming class with purchasing power. American demand for Japanese goods during the Korean War provided the initial economic boost. By 1968, Japan was the world's second largest economy. South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore followed similar paths through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Collectively, the East Asian economic miracle. China followed from the 1980s onward. Today, more than 1 billion people in East Asia live in conditions of material comfort that would have seemed impossible to their grandparents. The chain of causation, war, defeat, occupation, deliberate reconstruction, industrialization, and sustained growth, produced one of the most significant reductions in human poverty in history. The human outcome, whatever its complexities, is among the most remarkable things that has happened since 1945. Fact number 70. The war produced the concept of genocide education, and the figure at the center of that tradition is a 15-year-old girl from Amsterdam. Anne Frank kept a diary in the apartment where her family hid from 1942 to 1944. Her father, the only member of their group to survive the camps, published it in 1947. It has since been translated into 70 languages and sold over 35 million copies. It is assigned reading in schools across dozens of countries, adapted as a stage play, a film, and a museum that draws over 1 million visitors each year. Anne Frank died in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in the early weeks of 1945, weeks before it was liberated. She was 15. The diary's power rests on its ordinariness, the concerns of a teenager about friendship, boys, identity, and family, set against a background of escalating horror. It makes the Holocaust personal in a way that statistics simply cannot. The decision by educators and governments to teach about genocide through personal testimony, through diaries, memoirs, and survivor accounts, grew from the post-war recognition that numbers are not enough. Anne Frank's diary was where that recognition began. Fact number 71. The war transformed the relationship between citizens and their governments in ways that have never fully been reversed. People who had accepted extraordinary wartime sacrifices, rationing, evacuation, military service, the loss of family, came home with different expectations. Governments that had asked so much felt obligated to deliver something in return. In Britain, the Beveridge Report had given those expectations a name and a program. In America, the GI Bill had given them concrete form. Across Western Europe, the post-war social compact took shape as public healthcare, education, housing, and income support, the welfare state. These compacts did not go unchallenged. The political movements of the 1980s argued that the welfare state had grown beyond its proper scope, but even the most ambitious versions of that argument left the essential structure intact. The NHS survived Thatcher, Social Security survived Reagan. The political center of gravity in most Western democracies still rests on a foundation laid by people who had fought a war and come home expecting their societies to be something worth having fought for. That expectation, and the institutions built to meet it are the war's most enduring domestic legacy. Fact number 72. The war created the modern arms trade. Before 1939, weapons were produced primarily for national use and traded internationally in relatively modest quantities. The industrial-scale production of weapons during the war, followed immediately by the Cold War demand for military equipment from client states on every continent, turned weapons manufacturing into a permanent and enormous global industry. The United States and Soviet Union both equipped proxy armies across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America with military hardware. Much of it descended directly from wartime designs, continuously upgraded. The global arms trade is now worth roughly $100 billion per year. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the countries given their positions because of their role in winning the war, account for the majority of global arms exports. The same nations that built the institutions of international peace after 1945 have also been the primary suppliers of weapons to the wars fought since. This contradiction is one of the war's least resolved legacies, and one of the most consequential. Fact number 73. Before the Second World War, the United States had a deep and genuine tradition of staying out of European affairs. The First World War had been widely seen as a mistake, and the isolationism of the 1930s reflected real and widespread public reluctance. The Second World War changed this, perhaps permanently. The US entered Europe militarily, invested blood and resources on a scale that created a sense of obligation and responsibility, and emerged as Europe's principal protector. The Marshall Plan, NATO, the American military presence in Germany, the nuclear umbrella, these created a transatlantic relationship that was simultaneously a military alliance, an economic partnership, and a deep cultural bond. American popular culture, jazz, cinema, fast food, consumer goods, flooded into Europe after liberation and became part of the texture of post-war European life. European integration itself, from the coal and steel community in 1951 to the European Union today, was actively encouraged by Washington as a way of preventing another European war. The US-European relationship, its warmth, its tensions, its shared values and arguments about who pays for what, has been the central axis of the Western world for 8 decades. The war built it, and it has been maintained with some difficulty ever since. Fact number 74. The war transformed transfusion medicine and exposed in the process one of the more troubling expressions of racial segregation in American life. When the American Red Cross began collecting blood in 1941, it segregated donations by race. Blood from black donors was stored separately and not transfused into white patients. There was no medical basis for this. Blood type, not race, determines compatibility. The American Medical Association knew this, so did the Red Cross. But the policy was maintained under social and institutional pressure, reflecting the same racial segregation that governed the military, housing, and public life. The policy ended in 1950. The history of racially segregated blood banking became one of the reference points of the civil rights movement, an example of discrimination imposed on an act as intimate and consequential as a donation given to save someone's life. It also contributed to a distrust of medical institutions in black communities that researchers have documented as persistent across generations. The wartime blood supply system was one of medicine's great achievements. The racial policies imposed on it were one of its deepest contradictions, and their effects have not entirely faded. Fact number 75. The war produced the modern science of nutrition. Vitamins and minerals were still being discovered and understood in the 1930s. The war created vast and terrible natural experiments. The Siege of Leningrad, the Dutch hunger winter, the Bengal famine, that provided researchers with detailed data on what the human body does when specific nutrients are absent. The Dutch hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, during which approximately 20,000 Dutch civilians died of starvation and the surviving population was reduced to roughly 400 calories a day, has been studied by researchers for decades since. Studies of women who were pregnant during the famine showed that their children and grandchildren had elevated rates of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. research that became foundational to the science of developmental health and to the modern understanding that nutrition during pregnancy shapes health outcomes for generations. Every nutritional guideline, every understanding of how early malnutrition affects adult life, every public health program addressing diet and pregnancy. This knowledge was shaped in significant part by what the war did to civilian populations, and by the researchers who studied its consequences with care and precision. Fact number 76. The war fully realized the concept of total war. The idea that an entire nation's economy, population, and collective spirit are legitimate military targets. And that concept has never been contained again. Strategic bombing theory, developed in the 1930s and carried out at devastating scale between 1939 and 1945, held that destroying an enemy's factories and civilian morale was as valid a strategy as defeating its armies in the field. The bombing of cities, Rotterdam, London, Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, was the application of that theory. After the war, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey found that civilian morale under bombing had often increased rather than collapsed, that bombing hardened rather than broke resistance. But the capability remained, refined and expanded. Modern cruise missiles, stealth aircraft, and precision strikes on infrastructure are the current expressions of the same strategic thinking. Every debate about what constitutes a legitimate military target, electricity grids, water systems, communication networks, is a descendant of the Second World War argument about what could and could not be bombed. The laws of war attempt to prohibit attacks on civilian populations. The capability and the doctrine to conduct them remain in every major military arsenal. Fact number 77. The war left China and the United States with a relationship of mutual suspicion that has grown more complex with each passing decade. The US had supported nationalist China and was profoundly unsettled by the communist victory in 1949. The Korean War placed American and Chinese forces in direct combat. The US refused to formally recognize the People's Republic until Nixon's historic opening in 1972. The status of Taiwan, which the People's Republic claims as sovereign territory, has been the central unresolved question in US-China relations ever since. Today, the US and China are the world's two largest economies, deeply interdependent in trade and deeply competitive in military and technological terms. The Taiwan Strait is widely regarded as the world's most dangerous potential flashpoint. All of this, the economic rivalry, the military competition, the ideological tension, the Taiwan question, has its roots in the way the Second World War ended in Asia, in the choices made during the occupation of Japan, and in the Chinese Civil War that Japan's defeat made possible. The war in Asia did not resolve cleanly. Its unfinished threads remain among the most consequential in the world today. Fact number 78. The war drove the development of modern logistics, and modern logistics shapes nearly everything about how the global economy functions. Moving millions of soldiers and billions of tons of equipment to multiple theaters simultaneously required standardized containers, improved loading systems, expanded air cargo, and vastly increased shipping capacity. After the war, these capabilities moved directly into civilian trade. Malcolm McLean's invention of the standardized shipping container in 1956, which made it possible to load and unload ships in hours rather than days, built directly on wartime ideas about standardization and efficiency. The container ship transformed global trade by reducing costs so dramatically that manufacturing on one side of the world and selling on the other became economically rational. The global supply chain delivering your clothes, electronics, and food across continents in days is the civilian successor to the wartime logistics revolution. The war needed to move everything, everywhere, quickly. The systems it built to do so never stopped. They simply changed what they were moving and for whom. Fact number 79. The war produced the modern understanding of human rights, and the most important single document in that history is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations on December 10, 1948. The declaration was drafted by a committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, drawing representatives from multiple countries and cultures. Its 30 articles cover civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights: the right to life, to freedom from torture, to education, to meaningful work, to participate in one's community. It was written directly in response to what the war had shown was possible when governments operated without any external standard governing how they treated people. The Declaration has no direct enforcement mechanism, but it has provided the moral and legal foundation for every human rights treaty, convention, and court established since. Human rights advocates around the world use it as a reference point and a measure of accountability. It was written by people who had just watched what happened when no such standard existed, and it has been read, argued over, violated, and defended every single day since December 10th, 1948. Fact number 80. The war created the modern insurance industry in its current form. The scale of wartime destruction, the bombing of cities, the sinking of merchant shipping, the collapse of industrial infrastructure, produced losses so large that individual insurance companies could not cover them. Governments stepped in as reinsurers of last resort, and the institutional relationship between private insurance and government guarantee that characterizes the modern industry was built in those years. War risk insurance, catastrophe reinsurance, and the frameworks for managing losses that are simultaneous and enormous, what the industry calls correlated risks, were developed in direct response to the wartime experience. After the war, the same institutions and frameworks were applied to other forms of catastrophic risk: floods, earthquakes, industrial disasters. The global reinsurance industry, led by companies like Munich Re and Swiss Re, has its origins in the wartime need to manage losses on a scale no single company could absorb. The insurance policy protecting your home draws on a risk management framework built, at least in part, by the fires that consumed European cities between 1940 and 1945. Fact number 81. The war accelerated decolonization in the Caribbean in ways that profoundly shaped modern Britain. Caribbean colonial territories contributed thousands of men and women to the British armed forces and to the British wartime economy. Those who served found that their wartime experience sharpened expectations of equal treatment and self-governance when they returned. When the British government invited Caribbean workers to help rebuild the post-war economy, nearly 500,000 came between 1948 and 1971. The Windrush generation, named after the ship Empire Windrush that carried the first arrivals in June 1948. They built the NHS, the public transport networks, and the service economy of post-war Britain, and they transformed British society and culture in ways that are still unfolding. Their descendants are a fundamental part of British national life. The 2018 Windrush scandal, in Infos, which the Home Office threatened to deport elderly Caribbean-born British citizens who could not document their immigration status, demonstrated how the legacy of the wartime relationship between Britain and its Caribbean territories was still live and still contested, 70 years after that first ship docked at Tilbury. Fact number 82. The war proved, at terrible cost, that industrial society could be organized to commit mass murder. The Holocaust was not an explosion of ancient hatreds. It was a bureaucratic, industrial, logistical enterprise, involving railways and timetables, administrative paperwork, chemical engineering, and the quiet compliance of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who were not sadists but were functionaries doing their jobs. When Hannah Arendt covered the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann, she coined the phrase "the banality of evil" to describe what she observed: not a monster, but an efficient administrator who had organized the murder of millions without engaging his conscience. The lesson: that genocide does not require extraordinary evil, only compliant institutions and ordinary people willing to follow instructions, has been central to Holocaust education ever since. It is also deeply uncomfortable because it is not specific to one nation or one era. Every society in which institutional power goes unchecked, minorities are systematically dehumanized, and individual conscience is subordinated to authority contains some of the conditions Arendt identified. Every generation since 1945 has had to honestly ask whether its own structures carry those same seeds. The asking does not get easier with time. Fact number 83. The war transformed photography and established visual journalism as a moral and political force. The development of small, lightweight cameras in the 1930s was accelerated by wartime photojournalists who needed to capture images with intimacy and immediacy in conditions where older equipment was impossible to use. Robert Capa, Margaret Bourke-White, and others made photographs that shaped public understanding of the war in ways that written reporting could not match. Capa's D-Day images, Bourke-White's photographs of Buchenwald, Joe Rosenthal's flag raising at Iwo Jima. These images established the moral authority of the war photograph as a political document. The tradition continued in every conflict since. Eddie Adams's photograph of a summary execution during the Vietnam War, and Nick Ute's image of a child burned by napalm, changed the politics of that war in ways that proved the lasting power of the wartime photographic legacy. Today, smartphone images from conflict zones reach global audiences within minutes. The question of whether visual evidence of suffering actually changes political behavior is as unresolved as it was when Bourke-White walked into Buchenwald in April 1945 and raised her camera. Fact number 84. The war created the modern system of international development aid. Before 1945, wealthy countries occasionally provided charitable assistance to poorer territories, but no systematic international framework existed. The Marshall Plan was the first example of large-scale deliberate resource transfer from one group of nations to another for the purpose of rebuilding economies, and the model was adapted for the developing world almost immediately. President Truman's inaugural address in 1949 proposed technical assistance to underdeveloped countries as a fourth point of American foreign policy. The World Bank began lending to developing nations for infrastructure and economic growth. The UN's specialized agencies began systematic programs in agriculture, health, education, and industry. The Cold War gave development aid an ideological dimension. Both superpowers used it to attract allies. But the institutional infrastructure built during this period remains the primary vehicle for international poverty reduction today. The Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the UN in 2015, with their targets across health, education, and environment, are the latest iteration of a framework whose institutional foundations were laid in the ashes of the Second World War. Fact number 85. One of the most intimate ways the war remains present in daily life is through the landscape of remembrance. War memorials, military cemeteries, museums, and national days of commemoration are physical and temporal structures that shape public space and public consciousness in every country that participated. The Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, with its 9,386 graves, receives approximately 1 million visitors each year. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum has welcomed over 70 million visitors since 1955. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the Imperial War Museum in London, the National WWII Museum in New Orleans. These institutions collectively shape how tens of millions of people each year understand what happened between 1939 and 1945 and what it means for them now. Remembrance Sunday, Victory in Europe Day, Yom HaShoah, the August the 6th ceremony at Hiroshima. These recurring dates structure the public calendar and keep the war present in collective memory. The decisions about who is commemorated, how, and through what lens are political decisions, contested and revised in each generation. Memory is never simply about the past, it is always also about the present. Fact number 86. The war gave the world modern intelligence agencies in their current form. Before 1939, intelligence services existed but were small, underfunded, and focused primarily on military reconnaissance. The war created the Office of Strategic Services in the United States, which became the CIA in 1947. It created GCHQ in Britain, grown from the Bletchley Park code-breaking operation. It established the Mossad in Israel in 1949, and formalized and massively expanded the intelligence apparatus in the Soviet Union. These agencies, and their counterparts in France, Germany, China, and elsewhere, are permanent features of the modern state. They monitor communications, recruit sources, and conduct covert operations largely invisible to the public. The surveillance capabilities revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013 the bulk collection of telecommunications data by the NSA, the interception of transatlantic cables by GCHQ, are technological expansions of the wartime signals intelligence programs that cracked Enigma. The national security state, with its classified budgets, its parallel legal structures, and its intelligence communities operating beyond ordinary democratic oversight, was created by the war and has been growing in capability ever since. Fact number 87. The war produced the modern city-state of Singapore. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Singapore was a British colony that had endured 3.5 years of brutal occupation, including massacres that killed tens of thousands of ethnic Chinese Singaporeans in the weeks after the island fell. The war destroyed British prestige in Asia and made colonial rule politically impossible to sustain. Singapore moved towards self-governance in 1959 under Lee Kuan Yew and became fully independent in 1965. Under Lee's government, Singapore pursued a model that combined state direction of the economy, rigorous anti-corruption enforcement, world-class infrastructure, and aggressive attraction of foreign investment. The results were extraordinary. GDP per capita in Singapore today is approximately $65,000, higher than in Britain, which once ruled it. Its port is the world's second busiest. Its airport is consistently rated the world's best. The country exists as an independent, prosperous nation because of what the war did to the British Empire in Asia. Lee Kuan Yew said many times that the fall of Singapore to Japan in February 1942 was the event that made him certain British colonialism was finished. Fact number 88. The war gave the world the formal concept of a crime committed against a specific people. And the specific people who first gave it concrete legal form were the Jews of Europe. The Nuremberg trials defined crimes against humanity in part through the evidence of the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people through organized, deliberate, industrial means. This definition, that the targeted destruction of a people is a crime with universal legal standing, not merely a domestic political matter, was genuinely new. It has been applied since to Cambodians under the Khmer Rouge, to Tutsis in Rwanda, to Bosniaks at Srebrenica, and to Rohingya in Myanmar. Each application has been contested. None has been fully consistent. But the category itself, the idea that some acts are so extreme they constitute crimes not merely against their victims, but against humanity as a whole, exists because of the war. The International Criminal Court, established in 2002 with 124 member states, is the permanent institutional expression of this idea, however imperfect its record. Its existence as a permanent international criminal jurisdiction is one of the most consequential legal creations the war left behind. Fact number 89. The war established English as the global language of science, business, and aviation. Before 1939, scientific publishing was genuinely multilingual. German dominated physics and chemistry, French had strong claims in mathematics and medicine. The war ended German science's international leadership, scattered its practitioners across English-speaking countries, and positioned American science as the dominant force in global research. The post-war American research universities, generously funded and staffed partly by European refugees, made English the language in which the most important scientific work was published. The Chicago Convention of 1944 mandated English as the global language of air traffic control, a requirement still in force today. The Marshall Plan, Hollywood, American popular culture, and the structures of the American-led international economy reinforced English across Europe and then across the world. Today, approximately 1.5 billion people speak English, roughly 20% of the global population, and it is the primary language of international business, science, the internet, and aviation. This dominance is inseparable from the war, from the displacement of German science, the American occupation of Japan, and the post-war order that made English the language in which the world did its most important business. Fact number 90. The war produced the suburb as a way of life. Suburban living had existed before the war but was limited to those who could afford it. The GI Bill's home loan benefits, the rapid post-war construction of affordable housing, the mass production of automobiles, and the interstate highway system authorized in 1956 and explicitly modeled on Germany's wartime Autobahn, made suburban life accessible to the American middle class at enormous scale. Between 1946 and 1965, more than 13 million new homes were built in the United States, the great majority in suburbs. The suburbs shaped American culture in ways that are still defining it. The car-dependent lifestyle, the private domestic space, the separation of home from work and commerce, and the racial segregation built into many developments through restrictive property covenants. The carbon footprint of car-dependent suburban living is one of the primary contributors to American greenhouse gas emissions. The infrastructure of highways, parking lots, and dispersed development that characterizes American cities was built between 1945 and 1975 on the foundation of the post-war suburban expansion. The war created the conditions, and the suburb created the America that followed. Fact number 91. The war created the film industry's understanding of itself as a medium with moral responsibilities. Hollywood mobilized during the war. Directors and filmmakers entered military service, produced combat documentaries, and collaborated with the US government on films designed to explain the war and sustain the commitment to fight it. The collaboration established both a precedent and an expectation that cinema should engage with political and moral questions of the day. After the war, the films that grappled with its consequences established a tradition of prestige cinema that has never been exhausted. The Best Years of Our Lives in 1946, Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961, Schindler's List in 1993, The Pianist in 2002, Dunkirk in 2017. Each generation has returned to the war as a subject of unique moral weight. The Academy Awards, the Cannes Film Festival, the entire apparatus of serious cinema culture developed in the post-war period, in a cultural environment profoundly shaped by what the war had been and what it had meant. The war gave cinema a subject so vast and so morally serious that it has never stopped providing material, and film has never stopped trying to find language adequate to it. Fact number 92. The war ended one empire and quietly created another. The British Empire at its peak had covered roughly 25% of the world's land area. The cost of fighting the war, in borrowed money, in industrial exhaustion, in lost imperial prestige, left Britain unable to maintain it. India became independent in 1947. The rest followed through the 1950s and 1960s. By 1997, when Hong Kong was returned to China, the British Empire was essentially over. Into the space it left, the American Empire, informal, exercised through economic dominance, military alliances, cultural reach, and dollar-denominated global trade, expanded to fill. The United States prefers not to use the word empire, and its system differs in important ways from European colonial rule. But the American-led international order that replaced European dominance after the war shares with empire the essential characteristic that one power shapes the rules within which all others must operate. The transition from British to American hegemony, completed by the war, is the defining geopolitical fact of the last 80 years. Fact number 93. The war produced the modern legal framework governing the treatment of prisoners. The German treatment of Soviet POWs, approximately 3.3 million of the 5.7 million captured died in captivity, and the Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners, roughly 27% of those held died, revealed how completely the existing international rules had failed. The Third Geneva Convention of 1949, written directly in response, requires that prisoners of war be treated humanely, housed adequately, fed sufficiently, given medical care, permitted to communicate with their families, and not subjected to dangerous or military labor. Its application has been contested in every conflict since, most controversially by the United States after September 11, 2001. When the Bush administration argued that captured fighters in Afghanistan were not covered by the convention. That argument, and the debate it generated about Guantanamo Bay, about what protections apply and to whom, is still legally and politically unresolved. The question of who is entitled to the protections of the laws of war, defined in response to the Second World War, has been one of the most contentious legal questions of the 21st century. Fact number 94. Germany built the Autobahn between 1933 and 1938, a modern highway network partly intended as a public works project, partly for military logistics. American generals driving its lanes during the Allied advance into Germany in 1945 were struck by what they saw. Eisenhower returned home determined to build something similar. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which authorized the U.S. interstate highway system, was justified partly on national defense grounds, the ability to move military equipment rapidly across the country in an emergency. The 77,960 kilometers of interstate highway, largely built by 1980, restructured the American economy, made passenger rail uncompetitive, transformed trucking and retail supply chains, and reshaped the physical geography of American cities in ways that cannot easily be undone. Germany's Autobahn has since been copied by road systems across Europe and China. The car-dependent world, with all its consequences for emissions, urban form, and public health, traces part of its origin to a highway network built by Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and to an American general who drove down it in 1945 and had an idea. Fact number 95. The war changed what we eat in ways that reach far beyond wartime rationing. The industrialization of food production, canned goods, frozen food, dehydrated rations, concentrated provisions for military use, transferred directly into the civilian food supply after the war. Advances in freezing and cold chain logistics made frozen food commercially viable at scale. The television dinner, introduced in 1953, was the direct commercial descendant of the military meal pack. McDonald's opened its first franchised restaurant in 1953, Burger King in 1954, both built on the same principles of standardized, mass-produced, efficient food that the military had applied to feeding armies. The modern food system, its reliance on processed and preserved foods, its fast food culture, its industrial agriculture, was shaped by the wartime imperative to feed millions of people cheaply, quickly, and consistently. The obesity epidemic, the rise of processed food as a dominant part of the global diet, and the transformation of eating habits across the developed world in the last 8 decades all connect in meaningful ways to what the war needed food to be and the systems it built to produce it. Fact number 96. The war's most enduring psychological legacy may be the framework it produced for understanding human resilience. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian Jewish psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz and Dachau, published Man's Search for Meaning in 1946. The book described his experience in the camps and drew from it a psychological insight that people can endure almost anything if they have a reason to survive, a sense of meaning or purpose that reaches beyond their immediate suffering. The book has sold over 16 million copies, translated into more than 50 languages, and remains one of the most widely read works in psychology anywhere in the world. Its influence extends through psychotherapy, resilience training, pastoral care, management philosophy, and the support given to people facing terminal illness or profound loss. The modern positive psychology movement, with its emphasis on meaning, purpose, and the possibility of growth through suffering, draws directly from Frankl's thinking. The war produced the worst thing human beings have ever done to each other in a sustained and organized way. It also produced, in response, one of the most quietly important and consoling frameworks for understanding human endurance that anyone has ever written. Fact number 97. The war created the modern humanitarian system. The International Committee of the Red Cross had existed since 1863, but the scale of the war, the millions of prisoners, the tens of millions displaced, the families separated across entire continents, transformed it into a major international institution. By the war's end, the ICRC had exchanged 120 million messages between prisoners and their families, and processed millions of tracing requests. The limitations it encountered, including its failure to more publicly challenge the Holocaust, constrained by the need to maintain access to all parties, have shaped debates about humanitarian neutrality ever since. The modern cluster of humanitarian organizations, Médecins Sans Frontières, CARE, Save the Children, and dozens of others, was shaped by the wartime experience of the ICRC. The core principles of humanitarian action, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence, were formulated in direct response to what the ICRC had faced between 1939 and 1945, both in what it managed to do and in what it could not bring itself to say. Fact number 98. The war created modern risk assessment. The engineering and strategic planning challenges involved. How do you move 150,000 men across the channel onto a defended beach? How many aircraft does it take to destroy a particular factory? How do you estimate the probability that a convoy will be intercepted? Required the systematic quantification of uncertainty in ways that peacetime industry and government had never needed. Operations research, the mathematical field dedicated to optimizing complex systems and managing risk under uncertainty, was essentially created during the war by teams at the Admiralty, at Bomber Command, and in American military planning departments. After the war, these methods moved into business, medicine, and public policy. They became the intellectual foundation of management consulting, supply chain optimization, financial risk modeling, healthcare resource allocation, and eventually the algorithms governing internet search, social media feeds, and financial trading. Every time an insurance company calculates a premium, a hospital allocates resources, a logistics company optimizes a delivery route, or an algorithm shapes what you see on your phone, it is using methods whose systematic development began in the wartime operations rooms of the Second World War. Fact number 99. The war created modern international sports. The 1936 Berlin Olympics had been used explicitly as a Nazi propaganda showcase, a reminder of what international sporting events could be weaponized for. After the war, the International Olympic Committee reconstituted the Games in London in 1948. The austerity games, held in a city still under food rationing, as a symbol of peace and post-war reconstruction. Germany and Japan were excluded. Their subsequent readmission modeled the idea that sporting competition could be a vehicle for diplomatic normalization. The Cold War gave the Olympics an ideological dimension. American and Soviet athletes competing in the pool and on the track as proxies for the competition between two world systems. The 1980 and 1984 Olympic boycotts were explicit extensions of geopolitical conflict into sport. The modern Olympics, the FIFA World Cup, and international sports governance more broadly, are all products of the post-war world that the war shaped. Sport became politics by other means because the war had made politics so destructive that every arena where competition could happen without killing anyone seemed genuinely worth preserving. Fact number 100. The war taught the world a lesson about appeasement. A lesson that has been applied, misapplied, and debated ever since. The Munich Agreement of September 1938, in which Britain and France allowed Hitler to annex a part of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a promise of no further demands, became the defining example of diplomatic failure in the 20th century. Chamberlain's return with his piece of paper guaranteeing peace was followed within months by the occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia, and within a year by the invasion of Poland. The lesson policymakers drew: that authoritarian leaders cannot be satisfied with concessions, that appeasement invites further aggression, that credible resistance must be demonstrated, has been cited in virtually every foreign policy crisis since. The Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, NATO's response to Russian aggression, in each case the Munich analogy appeared. It has been misused as often as it has been correctly applied. Not every territorial dispute is Munich, and not every concession is appeasement. But the shadow of that one agreement, reached on a September afternoon in 1938, has hung over Western foreign policy decision-making for 80 years, and shows no sign of lifting. Fact number 101. The war ended formally at 9:04 in the morning on September 2, 1945, when Japan's foreign minister signed the instrument of surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. 6 years and 1 day after it had begun, between 70 and 85 million people were dead. The physical destruction across Europe, Asia, and North Africa was almost beyond comprehension. Cities were rubble, families were scattered or gone entirely. The world that had existed on September 1, 1939, had been replaced by something entirely different. What was built on top of that destruction? The institutions, the technologies, the laws, the medicines, the languages, the borders, the cultural forms, is what we live in today. The United Nations building in New York, the microwave in your kitchen, the antibiotic in your medicine cabinet, the passport in your drawer, the GPS on your phone, the suburb where you might sleep tonight, the welfare state that may have delivered you into the world, the concept of human rights that gives you standing to speak against injustice. All of it was built in the wreckage of the most destructive event in human history. The war is over. Nothing about it is finished. There is a quiet temptation when thinking about the Second World War to treat it as something sealed away, belonging to black and white photographs, to old men with medals, to a time that feels very far from this one. That temptation is worth gently resisting. Think about the last time you saw a doctor. The hospital you walked into was organized around a model of emergency care developed under fire in field hospitals and military wards. The antibiotic you may have received was mass-produced because soldiers in 1944 needed it urgently. The blood bank that supplied the operating room was built on techniques developed when medicine had to keep young men alive long enough to reach surgery. The ethics committee overseeing clinical research at that hospital exists because of what happened in the camps and because of the code written in response to it. The war ended on a Tuesday morning in Tokyo Bay. The world it made has not ended. It is the world you are living in on this very day. Close your eyes now and let the day begin to soften. Picture a morning from a different time, light filtering gently through curtains drawn carefully against the dark. Children preparing quietly for school, steady and patient as they had been taught to be. Parents measuring carefully, preparing meals with what they had, teaching resourcefulness not with lectures but simply by living it. Outside, the rhythm of ordinary life, the sound of buses, the murmur of neighbors, the small daily acts of people looking after one another. Every sound, every movement, part of something larger than itself. As your breathing slows, think of the quiet lessons that moved through time without being announced. Generations who lived through scarcity and disruption learned the value of planning, of care, of cooperation. Today those lessons are present in the ordinary, in the way we budget, tend to our homes, raise our children, prepare for the unexpected, reach toward each other in community. They remind us that the small acts of daily life carry a significance beyond the moment. They connect us, quietly and without fanfare, to a past that asked a great deal of ordinary people, and to a present that benefits in ways we rarely notice from the care they took. Let that thought settle gently. Let the day release its hold. You are resting in a world built by people who kept going. Sleep well.